Welcome to another broadcast of Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet. Joining me now in studio, your other host, Captain Ron. We have Dr. Robert Schoch with us today. We're going to be talking about his latest book, Origins of the Sphinx, Celestial Guardians of Pre-Pharaohonic Civilizations. In this new book, there's new research and evidence that the Sphinx is thousands of years older than previously thought. We will examine how the Sphinx is a contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe, aligned with the constellation Leo, and was recarved during the Old Kingdom era of Egypt. So much to talk about with this very fascinating author, and he also wrote the book with Robert Bauval. So please welcome to Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes true, author, professor, and researcher, Dr. Robert Schoch. Oh, welcome to the show. Robert, we really appreciate you joining Truth Be Told. How are you doing tonight?
Very good. Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
This is going to be great, and Captain Ron and I are a big fan of yours and this topic. So we're going to just start it off by, ever since the discovery of the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, that the biggest question was, how old is this really? And there's been so many dates and times thrown out at us. It's been kind of confusing for us everyday folks. But you're the man that's out there doing the research, doing the studies, and through your latest book, we want to know. So what is your guess, or is the date or period that the Sphinx was actually built?
Well, I would not put it as a guess. I would say quite definitively at this point, based on the evidence that I've compiled over really the better part of 30 years now, the origins of the Sphinx, and the new book is with Robert Bauval, is called Origins of the Sphinx.
Right.
And I just want to point out that that book focuses on the Sphinx. To put it all into context is my earlier book, Forgotten Civilization. So to make a very long story short, the origins of the Sphinx go back to before the end of the last ice age. The end of the last ice age, geologically dated, and I'm a geologist, that's what my PhD is in, geology and geophysics. The end of the last ice age is about 9700 BC.
Wow.
And the body of the Sphinx, and I am very emphatic that I want to say the core body, the original portion of the Sphinx, goes back, based on the evidence, to before 9700 BC. So it goes back to before the end of the last ice age. There was a cycle, what I call a cycle of civilization before the end of the last ice age, that was absolutely decimated, thrown into a tailspin with the natural disasters at the end of the last ice age. I want to make two very important points. One, when you look at the current Sphinx, everyone's heard of and many people have seen, I'm sure everyone's seen a photograph of the Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx is a Sphinx in the sense that it's a lion's body with a human head on it. That is not the original head. That is a recarved head. Second point I want to make is that those who have not been to Egypt often have the misconception that the Sphinx sits up on top of the plateau. It sits up above ground level. That's not the case. The Sphinx, the body of the Sphinx sits below ground level. And what I'm referring to is that to create the body of the Sphinx, they had to carve down into the solid bedrock. So it sits in what's known as the Sphinx ditch, informally, more technically, the Sphinx. And when you look body of the Sphinx and the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, and this was the first piece of evidence I had back in 1990 when I first got involved with this. You look at the walls of the Sphinx enclosure in particular, also the body of the Sphinx, where it can be seen underneath many layers of repair. what you have is water weathering. What I mean by that is it's weathering due to precipitation, due to rainfall, rainfall runoff, and this is incompatible with the Sahara conditions that have been there for the last 5,000 years. So that was really the start of the story. It has to go back to an earlier period. How much further back is based on many lines of evidence that we detail in particular in Origins of the Sphinx, and we can go into that if you like.
Yeah, I
But
would
bottom
love that.
line, it goes back to about 10,000 BC, the core body, the origins of the Sphinx. And I'm absolutely convinced of that at this point based on, again, solid scientific evidence.
I'm convinced as well. Doctor, if you'll indulge me for a second, I have kind of a long question for you, but this is what I wanted to ask you for some time. It's interesting you wrote this book with Robert Bauval because he also has stood up to the mainstream. Him and Graham Hancock, their whole thing about the pyramids being designed to align with Orion's belt, and that the age of it around 10,500 years ago. All that stuff was very, very hard. They're fighting against the mainstream viewpoint from Egyptologists as well. And I think they've gotten that Orion's belt thing kind of pretty much through. We saw Mr. Bauval speak at Contact in the Desert this year. And you mentioned that the pharaoh's head was not the original head. That's pretty much, I think everyone kind of agrees on that. Even Egyptologists seem to say that. I've seemed to see that everywhere. One of the claims, though, with Robert's argument is that it was a lion's head and that it lines up 10,500 years ago with the constellation of Leo. So that all fits in nicely. But have you heard about the Robert Temple, I believe is the guy who has that argument that perhaps the Sphinx was actually never a lion, but it was Anubis, the dog, because the paws are really more canine, and the way the tail is shaped, it's really that of Anubis. It matches up. What is your feeling on that?
Yeah, let me address several issues that you've raised. One, I just want to make a distinction because Robert Bauval, I have known Robert Bauval for decades, and we end up doing the book together, and it's really Robert Bauval's work that we're talking about when we're talking about the Orion correlation, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to put anyone else down, but we're talking about Robert Bauval's work, and I just want to make that clear when we're talking about Orion correlation. Other people have popularized it and written books with him, et cetera. That being said, there are two major approaches that have come together. And Robert Bauval and I have spoken about this quite a bit, and this is why we end up doing the book together. One is the Orion correlation theory and the background to that, which is much more than just the Orion correlation theory. It has to do with textual evidence from the ancient Egyptians themselves, from it's hard to get into in an interview like this, but I suggest that people look if they're interested in both Forgotten Civilization and Origins of the Sphinx. But the Orion correlation, which posits, which hypothesizes, which suggests, which some people would say is now proven, and I went back away from that the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau correlate with the belt of Orion in the sky, and not at just any time, but around 10,500 BC. That is archaeoastronomy. And that is all good and well. And I think I can speak for my colleague Robert Bauval here. That's all good and well, but that doesn't prove that the structures physically go back to that period. It could just be that the ancient Egyptians in dynastic times were referring back to an earlier time. Just for instance, as we today in 2017 can have a plaque that says George Washington slept here. The plaque is not back from the 18th century. So I just use that as an example. Right. And that was argued by some people that, okay, it's pointing back to earlier time. There's no real physical evidence. And what we put together where I come in is with the real physical evidence coming from a different approach, a different line of evidence that we really do have physical structures on the Giza Plateau and elsewhere in the world that go back to that earlier time period. And that includes the Proto-Sphinx. It also includes what's known as the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple, which are two temples in front of the Sphinx and just to the southeast of the Sphinx, which are built out of humongous limestone blocks weighing tens of tons. And interestingly and very pointedly, these blocks were carved out of the Sphinx enclosure when the body of the Sphinx was carved out. So they are contemporaneous with the carving of the body circa 10,000 or so BC. And I'm coming up with those dates independently of Robert Bauval, but it all ties together, which is why Robert Bauval and I, we were in Bulgaria together doing some geological and archaeological exploration. And we were talking about this, and we decided that why not put our work together? It dovetails so nicely, and that was the origins of the Sphinx book. Hey, two other things I want to address. I'm sorry I missed you at Contact in the Desert. I was there also.
We saw you.
Yeah, we did see you. Yeah.
Did we talk?
We didn't talk there, but we saw you speak.
Okay. Good. But we didn't have a chance to speak.
No.
It was so busy, so
yeah,
hectic.
it was crazy.
Interesting, very interesting conference. But the thing is, okay, the other question you just asked, which I'm not ignoring, is Robert Temple. And I'll be fairly blunt. Robert Temple doesn't know what he's talking about.
Got it. Hey, I wanted to know the real answer. That's good.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie about that. In Origins of the Sphinx and in Forgotten Civilization, I talk about Robert Temple and why he's wrong. He doesn't understand the geology. He doesn't understand the iconography. If it were Anubis, it wouldn't be facing east, it would be facing west. The paws of the Sphinx, it doesn't matter what you think they look like, you can't see the original paws. The paws of the Sphinx, for instance, are basically in mittens, if you want to call it that, of reconstructed limestone blocks, some of which are 20th century, if not 21st century. I say some of them are definitely 20th century reconstructions because I was there when they were putting some of them in. So there's a lot of issues with Robert Temple's Anubis theory and moat theory. He thinks that somehow the enclosure was filled with water at one point, and the Sphinx was essentially a statue in the middle of a little artificial lake. It just doesn't work. I mean, there's all kinds of different issues involved, and I talk about that in my publications.
Right.
And I don't want to be nasty to him. I don't know him particularly. But basic geology 101, and I hate to sound that way, if you know any basic geology, his hypothesis does not, to use a really bad pun, hold water.
Right.
Because the limestone of the plateau is very porous. It would not stand up to moat conditions. It would not form the weathering and erosion features that we see. You would have to line the whole thing with tiles or whatnot. Then you wouldn't get the weathering features that he claims prove his moat theory. It just doesn't make sense. The Anubis head, I could go on and on. I'll mention one there. who have an Anubis head in the proportions, etc., that he suggests. There's no evidence there was ever rock, because it's carved out of one solid piece of rock. There's no evidence that the head was ever that big or in those dimensions. And in fact, it's not clear to me as a geologist that the rock would be competent to hold the snout of Anubis and the ears of Anubis proportionally, even if there had been rock there.
The weight.
Okay, so I won't say anything more.
No, hey, listen, that was great, Robert. That's what I wanted to do. That's why I'm bringing this up. So I have another question for you now.
Read
So
my book.
I have, and listen to this. It's so compelling to me as a non-geologist and a non-scientist and somebody that doesn't know anything. You have laid this out to me so clear, so linear, and so convincingly that I'm sold. I'm done. I completely subscribe to exactly what you're saying. You've laid out a scientific argument as to why the Sphinx is not 4,000 years old. It's more like 10,000 years old, and you've proved it. You showed why, and you showed the water. So I'm sold. It's like a court of law, done. Why is it that your brothers over there at Yale and these Egyptologists and whatever still seem to combat you and not accept this I don't want to call it a theory because
That has
accept the
nothing
truth, I
to,
guess.
that has nothing to do with evidence per se. It has to do with psychology and sociology and pulling the rug out from under someone's beliefs and belief system, because the implications are so profound. And I believe we have to face those implications. But the implications are that there was, as again, I use the term cycle of civilization, there was genuine civilization, advanced people, sophisticated cultures 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, when the dogma says, the paradigm says, the standard worldview says we were all hunters and gatherers in an incredibly primitive and brutish state. This is a paradigm that has held sway for literally hundreds of years. And to change people's paradigms, to change their fundamental worldview about who they are, where they came from, what our past history was, to have to rewrite the history books in a fundamental way at the beginnings of civilization, people don't take that well. And I don't like comparing myself to the greats of science. But on the other hand, just to give you a perspective on it, everyone now takes it for granted that, yes, even though it looks like the sun goes around the earth actually goes around the sun. Well, I mean, maybe there's a few still out there that think the sun goes around the earth. But, in general, even the average person in the street, they understand that. But look how long that took to make headway.
It's hard to
Even
believe, though, but even like how you've laid it out so clear, it's like once we thought the Earth was flat, then some guy got in a boat, went around the Earth. Okay, well, now it's over. I think it should be fixed
Right,
immediately.
right.
Read your book. It's over.
But that's not the way science works. And,
Oh.
and the flat Earth, there's still flat Earthers out there.
Oh, yeah.
Does this drive you crazy that it hasn't been accepted, or how's that work for you?
It drives me crazy when people are going after me and attacking me personally, etc. But getting back to the heliocentric versus geocentric, all the science, all the evidence was there, certainly by Galileo's time. And remember that Galileo was put under house arrest. I mean, he was lucky he wasn't burnt at the stake. And he died under house arrest. And when did the Catholic Church, which of course was, and I'm not knocking the Catholic Church, but they were behind the times in this, when did they finally, quote, forgive him? 1992.
Oh, my God.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize that officially. Of course, everyone realized by then, long before then. But realistically, and I've looked at books and journals and whatnot from the early 1700s where they're at that point saying, well, these are the two alternative views, and they're comparing them to each other. And it didn't start with Galileo. It started with Copernicus essentially a century earlier. So things might move a little faster in today's day and age. Yeah, maybe it doesn't take centuries, but it also, there's a truism that you have to wait, to put it crudely, until the critics, the holders of the old paradigm die. That's to put it crudely. Or maybe we could say in nicer terms, retire and no longer are involved.
You would drive me nuts.
Right.
I mean, you've done all the work. It's like
us nuts.
Now, I want to take a little.
Because ideally, it should all be based on. It should all be based on evidence and whatnot. The other thing is the mechanism of what's happening. There's a lot of politics involved in that. So I talk about this in Forgotten Civilization, that what brought this early cycle of civilization to an end at the end of the last ice age was the same features, the same thing that brought the ice age to an end. And I believe all the evidence indicates this was a major solar outburst, solar eruptions, etc. That's not a popular view either, because a solar outburst is a paradigm change unto itself also. No one wants to hear that, a solar outburst could occur in the past and wipe out civilization, because it also has implications that it could occur again. And I will tell you, it will occur again. And we are incredibly vulnerable. So the bottom line is, for me, we've got the scientific evidence there for much older civilization. We've got evidence as to what happened to the civilization, but this is a radically different view than the standard paradigm. And it's not a very convenient view. I don't want to play on Al Gore, who I disagree with on many things when it comes to science. It's not global warming necessarily. Everyone's into global warming, and I want to be very clear. Getting off fossil fuels, not producing so much carbon dioxide, et cetera, is a really good thing. But there are other issues involved also.
Right.
Including the sun and the sun modulating and influencing climate change, which is what happened geologically when we look back through millions of years of rock record and ice cores. It's what happened at the end of the last ice age, and it continues to happen, and we are very vulnerable as a civilization. So there's a lot of different issues going on here, which people don't want to believe or accept because it has real implications for them, either in terms of their career, in terms of their fundamental beliefs. I have a cousin. I'll mention one other thing because this plays into religion. I have a cousin who is a fundamentalist Christian. Now, many fundamentalist literalists, to this day, there are people who don't believe that the Earth is even as old as I'm saying the Sphinx is.
Oh my
So
gosh.
you get that also.
Right,
Some of them still
right.
believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old
Which is
because
crazy.
that's when God created it, according to the King James Bible or their interpretation of it. No, I've been attacked by people like that.
But they're not geologists. You're a geologist. You've
Right.
been studying this for years and years and years.
And they were
I agree, but you tell a religious fanatic that.
right.
Well, yeah.
Well,
You tell any kind of fanatic that.
right.
When someone has very strong beliefs, this is my point. When someone has very strong beliefs, it can blind them to evidence. They can literally not see the evidence or not be able to.
Well, that's the whole point of our show, is like that. I feel like a lot of my views on a lot of these different topics have changed 180 degrees based on these things. Let's listen to the people that study this for a
Right,
living. That's the
right.
whole point.
Because I always tell anybody that listens to us, we're not experts. We're enthusiasts. We enjoy this, and that's why we have people like yourself on. But Doctor, I'd like to take a little trip with you that might be able to help people out there understand your theory, not even a theory, your statement that that Sphinx is at least 10,000 years old. Let's travel to Turkey and go to Göbekli Tepe. That has been proven to be over 10,000 years old. So
Yeah,
does this?
absolutely, because Göbekli Tepe. I just want to, don't take it the wrong way. I'm going to correct you a little bit.
Please. That's why I'm not an expert.
10,000 years old. Really, what you want to say is 12,000 years old, 10,000 BC.
Perfect.
Okay?
That's true.
We
Yes.
have to add
you're
another
right.
2,000 years there.
There we go.
Uh, when I first was talking about the Sphinx being much older, I was really attacked. I was very seriously attacked by my academic colleagues. They called me a pseudoscientist. Egyptologists told me that they didn't understand. They literally told me they didn't understand my evidence, but it didn't really matter to them because they knew how old the Sphinx was, and they weren't going to. Essentially, they told me, which is very unscientific, that they didn't care about the evidence I had. They knew how old the Sphinx was. All the Egyptologists agree with it. Now, my comment is you don't do things scientifically by vote. Science is not democratic.
Right.
Mm-hmm,
If you go back to the year 1600 and you take a vote as to whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun, we can imagine what the vote would have been. That doesn't make it right.
Right. Let's let the facts get in the way of this, right?
Yeah. Also, Egyptologists, and I don't mean to be nasty, but Egyptologists are not scientists. They might use some scientific techniques very begrudgingly, but they're not scientists. So they questioned me. This is the early 1990s when I was first looking into this. I had my evidence. I presented it to the scientific community. I published it in journals, et cetera, and I was really incredibly attacked to the point, and I should be flattered in hindsight, to the point that in 1992, very early on, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, you can't get any better than that or worse than that, decided to stage at their annual meeting a debate on the age of the Sphinx. And I was flattered because who gets that type of attention normally?
Right.
But what they were really trying to do was to shut me up because they had Egyptologists there, a guy named Mark Lehner in particular, who you may or may not have heard of, who was presenting the opposing point of view. Basically, as I see it in hindsight, they didn't care about my evidence. They just wanted to shut me up and they wanted to badmouth me, et cetera, et cetera. And his pivotal comment was, well, if the Sphinx, I'm paraphrasing badly, if the Sphinx is that old, where is there other evidence of civilization at that time? Where is there other evidence of advanced, sophisticated culture? And the problem at the time was that I really didn't have any other good evidence I could point to. But you have to remember, just because you don't have the second piece of evidence, it doesn't invalidate the first piece of evidence. And that was 1992. So I bring this up specifically. It was 1992. It was not until 3 years later that Klaus Schmidt, who unfortunately is now deceased, so the late Klaus Schmidt, Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, in 1995 began excavating the site known as Göbekli Tepe. It's in southeastern Turkey, very close to the Syrian border, so not a great place politically right now.
Right.
I do not recommend that people go there at the moment, just the average person to visit the site. In fact, it's closed down. I've taken people there in the past. I've been there numerous times myself, but it's a very volatile situation.
Is it actually closed down, the site, right now?
Yes, I heard within just the last couple of weeks that yes, it is actually
that's
closed
too
down.
bad.
That is such a shame.
That's
Yeah.
a shame.
Yeah, I mean, but the point right now for our discussion is that Göbekli Tepe is that piece of evidence. It is a separate and distinct site, but it's incredibly sophisticated. This site, unlike the Sphinx, it's a different type of site. It is composed of what they call stone circles or stone rings, stone enclosures, which are made out of beautifully carved, erected stone pillars. Not Stonehenge-like, because Stonehenge pillars are big, crude. I don't want to sound nasty about Stonehenge, but sort of big, crude, ugly pillars. I mean, Stonehenge is beautiful. I like going there. But it's a different style. Göbekli Tepe, the pillars are beautifully cut, nice, fine edges, smooth surfaces. They have carved animals and other things on them. They have carvings in the round. They have what they call the totem pole, which is a carved stone structure. And the thing about Göbekli Tepe, it shows incredible sophistication. I have spoken with archaeologists off the record who have said to me that if they just had one or two sculptures from Göbekli Tepe, or maybe one of the pillars, and they had no context for it, they had no dating on it, they might think it was 600 BC or 1000 BC.
Wow.
I've literally been told that by archaeologists off the record. Of course, they would never want that be quoted on that because it's incredibly sophisticated. The thing is, based on good geological dating, radiocarbon dating, and other types of analysis, it dates back to the end of the last ice age. So it dates back to the same period I'm talking about for the Great Sphinx. And it shows that the Sphinx is not an anomaly. It's not an isolated situation where we had a flowering of, a bunch of guys one day woke up and decided to carve the Sphinx and the temples that go with it in 10,000 BC. Here we have another equally sophisticated site, but in a different manner sophisticated, at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. It's
Well,
also very interesting that Göbekli Tepe has an Orion correlation, which I found there.
Oh, really?
The central pillars, the main pillars of Göbekli Tepe, based on my analysis, and I talk about this in my book, Forgotten Civilization, based on my analysis, they look out to the area of Orion and Taurus in the Pleiades, which are we know is very significant. That's a very significant portion of the sky for many ancient cultures. Bauval found that the Orion correlation we mentioned on the Giza plateau. Here we have it in the same time period at Göbekli Tepe. And I want to say that when I first found that, I was a little embarrassed because I didn't want people to think I was looking for Orion correlations just because Bauval, my colleague, had found them at Giza. But it's there. It's absolutely there. And it turns out that one of the central pillars, in particular, of one of the older enclosures, again dating back to about 10,000 to 9,700, that period, BC, not only looks out to Orion on the vernal equinox at that remote time period, it no longer does because of precessional changes, but it looks out and it looks like Orion. The pillar literally looks like Orion. It's got an incredible belt, which I interpret as the belt of Orion. It's got a fox pelt loincloth, which looks like, if you know Orion in the sky, there's a nebula in the same position. It's traveling. It's got under its arm a little dog type animal, which could easily be the dog star that follows Orion in the sky. It's surrounded by a ring of animals in the other pillars, more or less the zodiac. And I think it's a very compelling argument. My wife, Katie, and I have been there numerous times and looked at this very closely, and it's really an amazing sight.
Is there any evidence there of precession?
I'm sorry?
I was asking if there's any evidence there of precession as well.
Yes, absolutely. Because I'm glad you asked that, because what I found in particular is when you look at the different enclosures, they can be dated archaeologically and stratigraphically and geologically, by different techniques, dates and absolute dates. And what happens is that the older enclosures are oriented one way, and then their orientation slightly shifts. Well, why are they slightly shifting? Because they're always looking out to the same portion in the sky as the stars shift precessionally. So they are taking precession into account, which is really quite amazing, because the standard archaeoastronomers I shouldn't say archaeoastronomers, the standard historians of astronomy have claimed in the past that precession was not something that was known or understood or acknowledged by anyone until maybe Greek times, 2,300 years ago or somewhere in that time, or maybe Neo-Babylonian times, somewhat under 3,000 years ago. And here we see it 12,000.
It's insane to think that 12,000 years ago they could figure that out. I barely can get my head around it now.
When it comes to the stars, everything, it just baffles me.
Carve, I want to point out, to carve the Sphinx, to build the temples in front of it, to erect the structures that we see at Göbekli Tepe, you don't just do this. You don't just have a thought in your head. They must have been making plans. They had to organize things socially,
right.
And I'm sure they must have been, whatever they were writing on or using, they had to have some kind of plans. They had to have some concept of mathematics, astronomy. I mean, this is sophisticated stuff. This is not just a bunch of...
Yeah, Doc, listen, could you go ahead. Could you explain to our audience about this part you're talking? Go ahead.
I'm sorry?
I was going to say, could you please explain to our audience right there, you were just talking about they pulled these blocks out. Can you explain how there's 200-ton blocks and how they pulled them out and built the temple and all that?
No, I don't know how they did that, honestly. I'm a geologist, and this is one you're talking about now, the Sphinx. And
I don't mean how. I just mean that they did, that that those are the same blocks. Explain that.
They pulled out these incredible limestone blocks. In the case, now we're going back to the Sphinx, not Göbekli Tepe. because at the Sphinx you have blocks that weigh tens of tons, some of them 50 tons, some of them estimate up to over 100 tons. Yeah, some of the estimates have been up to 200 tons. But even if you're just talking blocks that are 20 tons, that's enough to be incredibly startling. And how they moved them, I don't know. But they cut them out as they were carving out the body of the Sphinx. And I want to make the point here, just so people really understand it. If you were going to simply carve out the body of the Sphinx from the bedrock, you could do it with chips, chisels, and hammers, and what do they call it?
Pickaxe?
Pickaxe, that's it. Pickaxe. More or less, you could chip away and just create rubble that you could take out in baskets. That's not what they did. They actually carved out these blocks weighing, from weighing tens of tons. Some of them estimate over 100 tons. But it doesn't even matter. Even if they were all just 10 tons, it would be impressive enough. They actually carved those out and moved them and built these temples. So that's an incredible feat. And there's no doubt about this. I've confirmed this geologically. Other geologists independently have confirmed that, yes, these blocks come out of that enclosure. You can even reconstruct it or try to reconstruct it like a giant three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle based on the stratigraphy, based on the rock layers and their sort of, we'll call it fingerprints. You can figure out which blocks came out of what portion of the enclosure. And so it's very well established. To do that today would be an incredible feat. To do it in dynastic Egyptian times would be an incredible feat. But to do it circa 10,000 BC, which is what all the evidence indicates, I mean, it just sort of boggles the mind.
Can we go back a little bit about the kind of the disappearance of this civilization? Because I know we talked about ice age, or not the ice age, but what did you say? A solar outburst and eruptions.
Yes, solar outburst. That's what I call it. General term, because a solar outburst would include things like solar flares, what are known as coronal mass ejections, CMEs. There would be, in modern terms, electromagnetic pulse that goes with it. It would have melted glaciers at high latitudes almost instantaneously. You'd have wildfires set because in some places, essentially what's known as electrical plasma, electrical discharges, electrically, particles.
Right.
So not the sun would be hitting the earth. They would literally set wildfires in some places. It would melt glaciers almost instantaneously as it hit directly. It would cause evaporation. You put all this moisture into the atmosphere, it would come down as torrential rain. So you would have flooding both on the surface of the earth, also because of melting glaciers and warming generally. The ocean levels would rise. We know that they rose 120 meters or so in total, or more in some places. I was going to say, not just because of melting glaciers, but a lot of people don't realize when you warm water, it expands. And when you've got ocean basins as big as they are, so the expansion of the water plus the melting glaciers, you'd have high radiation levels on the surface of the earth for periods of time that could kill animals, in particular large mammals, and we see extinction of the mammalian megafauna, as it's called in the geologic record, exactly at this time. Humans are large mammals. How did humans survive in places? And this has perplexed archaeologists. They found that, there's these caves and there's these underground shelters, if you would, at this time. Well, that's where people went if they were going to survive.
That's what I was going to ask you. I was going to say,
so
how
that's
did
how they survived. And if you think about the large mammals, they went extinct because they had no place to escape. Smaller mammals, in particular mice and rats and even cat-sized things, they could go into shelters, into caves. Some of them even naturally go into burrows. humans in some places just got wiped out. In other places, they were able to go into natural caves or artificial caves that they had constructed or constructed because of this, because this came in waves. So there's probably a general killing off. People realize, well, this could happen again. And there's evidence that they realized that and then made preparations until this, there would have been waves of this probably for centuries at least.
Well, I was going to ask you if the ancient Egypt after, when the pharaohs started, making themselves present on in Egypt, are they the descendants of this early civilization, or did they just replicate what they saw?
We don't really know. Honestly, I don't know. I cannot answer that definitively. I wanted to mention one other thing before I forget it. At the end of the last ice age, you also have vitrified glass, and people may have heard of that. Vitrification, places where rock was hit by what would have looked like huge thunderbolts, lightning bolts that literally flash melted and then it recongealed, and this is a natural form of glass, and you find that in Egypt and elsewhere at the end of the last ice age. Now, getting back to the ancient dynastic Egyptians, for instance, in the Old Kingdom, so Old Kingdom, think 4,500 or so years ago for classic Old Kingdom, they talk about a time known as Zep Tepe. They talk about an ancient people much, much earlier, thousands of years earlier. They talk about them as having had civilization. They saw them as their forerunners. Now, whether they were their forerunners literally in a genetic sense, or they simply inherited things from them or rediscovered things, I don't know. We can definitively answer that at this point.
It's like Atlantean, right?
What?
It's like Atlantis.
Well, I was going to say, I was about to bring up Atlantis because the story of Atlantis comes from Egypt. Plato got it from Solon, who got it from Egypt. And when you look at Atlantis' story, I put some stock in Atlantis now. I didn't when maybe I was a graduate student. I just accepted the common academic view that Atlantis is a big metaphor for, how you should have civilization, that type of thing, but that it wasn't necessarily real. I now think it has to be taken more seriously in the sense of he was recording at least some aspects of real history. And what is important to me for my work is not where was Atlantis. Everyone always talks about, oh, where is Atlantis? Is Atlantic Ocean, Mediterranean, Antarctica, who knows what. But what's important for me is that he's talking about a sophisticated civilization, what I call earlier cycle of civilization, that was destroyed by natural catastrophes. And when you look at the natural catastrophes Plato talks about, I think they're absolutely in line with a solar outburst. That's number one. Number two is Plato's dating of the fall of Atlantis. In the fall of Atlantis, the collapse of Atlantis and the Atlantean civilization corresponds with our modern dating of the end of the last ice age. Plato, by most people's interpretation, when you put Plato into our chronology, Plato's story of Atlantis into our chronology, Atlantis collapses about 9600 BC, which is very close, and I think not coincidental. I think it's significant that that is within a century of the modern dating of the collapse of these early civilizations at the end of the last ice age. I mean, he was talking in round numbers, 9,000 years prior to his ancestor, which gives about 9600 BC. I don't think we need he was all wrong because he's off by 100 years.
Right, yeah.
It all ties in. It all fits exactly right.
It all fits in together. Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting to me that I'm coming from a physical point of view, physical evidence, but it in fact fits together with the legends of Atlantis, with what the ancient Egyptians were saying 4,500 years ago. There are texts, and we talk about this in Origin of the Sphinx, that refer to the Sphinx in Zep Tepe as already be in existence, or was Zeb Tepe was an earlier era, and that the Sphinx was already in existence in classical dynastic times of the fourth dynasty, and this counters the it counters the Egyptologists who say it was only built from scratch at that time. I tend to believe at this point that the ancient Egyptians knew more about their early history than perhaps the modern Egyptologists.
I believe it.
This is great stuff.
Yeah, listen, I know we're running out of time here, but could you just briefly tell us? Didn't you go to Easter Island? Can you address Easter Island? What you thought of that?
I've been to Easter Island several times. Katie and I were married on Easter
Oh,
Island.
how awesome!
That's great.
Yeah, we love Easter Island, and Easter Island is probably another topic for it's a different topic.
It is.
We go on for hours about Easter Island, but what's interesting about Easter Island is that there's something, and this gets complicated, but I'll try and mention it briefly. There's two things about Easter Island I'll mention right now. One is the big moai, the statues, that type of thing, and some of them are probably late. And when I say late, 1,000 years old or even 500 years old, because they're making them for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the moai, they are buried in sediment many, many meters. And as a geologist, I don't believe they go back only to 1200 AD or only to, some people would say 800 AD. That's the standard archaeological view is that Easter Island was not colonized until very late in time. 500 to 1200 AD is the general range. I don't believe that for a second. Based on the evidence, I think it goes back much, much earlier. It may, in fact, also record on Easter Island things going back to the end of the last ice age. There are what are known as the basalt moai in particular, and we haven't found the quarries. No one's found the quarries where these were carved. But interestingly, the late Jacques Cousteau, everyone's heard of him, I hope, for his diving and all that type of thing. Speaking with Easter Islanders who remember the days when he was there, or heard it from their parents, he was diving around Easter Island. He apparently found what could be quarries underneath current sea level around. Yes, of course.
Wow.
Well, they would date back to this earlier period, end of the last ice age. So we may have evidence right at Easter Island. There's also what are known as petroglyphs in the Rongo script, which, let me just put it this way, may actually go back to the earlier period or have their origins much earlier and tie in with the solar outburst, which we don't really have time to talk about in great detail now. But there's a lot of interesting mysteries, and I use that term genuinely. It's not just sort of fake, made-up mysteries.
Right.
There's a lot to be learned from Easter Island, and I don't believe for a second that this classical archaeologists have it all figured out. And I do want to say one other thing about Easter Island, which is very important to me because I love Easter Island, and like I said, Katie and I have been married there, so it's very dear to us. There's this myth, and it's now being acknowledged as a modern myth, that somehow the Easter Islanders were stupid, dumb people who came to this pristine, beautiful paradise of an island and then destroyed it ecologically. And this was used for a number of years and popularized in a number of books that, it was ecocide. And this is a lesson that we need to learn to not do this to our Earth as a whole. It turns out the evidence is not there whatsoever that the Easter Islanders destroyed their island. All the evidence is that it wasn't destroyed until Europeans came and started capturing the Easter Islanders, taking them away as slaves, spreading disease, turning the island into a huge sheep ranch, which of course then devastated the island ecologically. So I just want to defend Easter Island.
Thank
there.
you for saying that. I agree. I've read that as well, and I feel the same way. And I'll tell you what, if I had a time machine, Tony, 10,000 years ago, or 10,000 BC is when I'd want to come see when all this stuff
that'd be great.
was in its prime.
Yes.
Because that's when it really was. I know it. I know
Oh,
it.
I agree with you. I would
closes
love
up.
to be able to go back 12,000 years to 10,000 BC.
Yep, that would be the time.
Well, we're going to have to ask you back and have another broadcast about Easter Island because our time is up. But you are such a fascinating and man that
no doubt
inspires us. And people go out and pick up the book Origins of the Sphinx, and you can pick it up on Amazon, and I'm sure at all the bookstores.
Yeah. Also, I got to put a plug in. Origins of the Sphinx, I just want to be clear, is on the Sphinx specifically, but for the bigger picture of other things we've been talking about, Forgotten Civilization, the subtitle's The Role of Solar Outbursts in Our Past and Future. Ideally, people should pick up both.
Perfect. And I think they should and they will. But thank you so much, sir. We really appreciate it. Come back and see us. And you can go to Robert Scott's your website. Is that
robertschoch.com?
My website is robertschoch.com.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And my last name is spelled Schoch because people often want to spell it the way they hear it, but
Right.
It's Schoch. So the website is www.robertschoch.com.
Perfect. Well,
Awesome.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate it, and thank everybody for tuning in for Truth Be Told. This is Tony Sweet and
Captain Ron.
we'll see you next time right here on Truth Be Told.
Thank you.